Welcome to today's France 24 debate, and we have got a truly international topic for you, something that affects every single one of us on the planet, in fact. As of today, we're being told that we have used up all of the Earth's natural resources capacity for this year. That's according to the groups that have dubbed August 2nd, 2017, Earth Overshoot Day. Now, the date is recalculated every year. These groups say that it is getting earlier every single time. Now, we can show you on your screen right now how that date has shifted back, tracking earlier over the last 40 years there. Back in 1977, Earth Overshoot Day falling on November 12th, just 6 weeks shy of the end of the year. So how accurate then is this assessment? What does it mean for the planet? And what could be done to put a brake on the situation? I am joined for our discussion by leading climate scientist Jørgen Randers, who joins us on the line from Norway. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And from Prague in the Czech Republic, we can say hello to Bjørn Lomborg, who's director of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre and someone who puts forward the idea of slashing the price of renewable energy to bring more of us into the climate change battle. Thank you also for being with us here on the France 24 debate.
Pleasure.
Now, Mr. Randers, if I come to you first, you've been hailed as having written the Bible on the environmental movement. It was called Limits to Growth all the way back in 1972. It seems so that the world hasn't been listening. Did you expect us to end up here 45 years on, Earth Overshoot Day falling 4 months before the end of the year?
Well, I'm afraid that was what we thought or believed would happen. We have, of course, worked very hard for the intervening 45 years to try to get a World Overshoot Day to become later in the year. In other words, to make humanity emit less climate gases and use less resources. But we have not succeeded.
Well, Mr. Lomborg, if I come to you, there's actually been some... Oh. Well, if I ask Mr. Lomborg about Earth Overshoot Day, there's been some dispute about how accurate this date is. Some people saying that it's hard to calculate this kind of thing. Is that actually important, though?
It is very, for two reasons. Let's just remember, while we have definitely had environmental problems, we've also succeeded in so many ways for the last 45 years. Remember, we brought more than 2 billion people out of poverty, possibly the biggest benefit in the world. That's an amazing achievement. And that was not because we listened to Mr. Randers, but that was because we continued with our aggressive focus on getting more food to people, more healthcare, more opportunities, more education. But yes, you're talking about, so what about this Earth Day? What about the fact that we may be overshooting? Well, the problem is that this is a dramatically flawed estimate. Yes, absolutely. If it was, is it the 2nd of August, this is the 10th of August, that obviously wouldn't be the case. But the reality is that the overshoot is entirely because they're estimating how we can avoid CO2 by planting forest. And what they're finding is you need to plant the entire globe every year with forest. And of course, that we can't do. That's why we're overshooting. But if we want to cut CO2, we could just plant solar panels and wind turbines, and we would not overshoot at all. We would actually be at around 70% of the world, which of course is a much better message.
Well, that all sounds very positive. Mr. Randers, if I can come back to you, are the solutions that simple as they seem to sound there?
Yes, they are, absolutely. You know, if, as Mr. Lomborg says, it was possible to convince the Western world to spend all the money it currently spends on building new fossil capacity, spend that on building windmills and building solar panels instead, we will solve the problem. We will keep the global warming below +2 degrees centigrade. So the very sad fact is that in spite of us and Lomborg having pushed this solution for decades, for some reason, you know, Western society does not want to do this. So they choose, to continue burning coal, oil, and gas, emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere all the time, thereby, creating a warmer world than the +2 degrees centigrade that is the current goal.
Well, in terms of solutions, we do hear plenty of them coming out from various different bodies all of the time. We've actually made a graphic of some of the solutions and actions that are suggested by the organisers of Earth Overshoot Day. They include things like going partially vegetarian, trying out a vegetarian recipe, I think they term it as, finding cleaner transport solutions, educating ourselves about the data, lobbying our lawmakers and our city leaders and fighting food waste. Now, Mr. Randers, these seem like much smaller scale solutions than what you were suggesting. Are people thinking a little bit too small scale?
They are thinking too small scale. On the other hand, these things would help if a large enough fraction of the population actually did so. But that is very unlikely to happen. The only single strong thing that actually would help is to stop investing in new coal, stop investing in new oil, and stop investing in new gas. That's what needs to be done, and first in the rich world and then gradually in the poor world, paid for by the rich. This is the one action that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 72% and would be enough, if implemented from now until 2050, to keep the world from exceeding +2 degrees centigrade. Actually, our models show that if we did this, the temperature would peak at roughly +1.5 degrees centigrade.
Well, you raise an interesting point there about who's going to take leadership on this, who's going to pay for the science, for some of the research and development that might get us to a better situation for the planet. Mr. Lomborg, I know that you've spoken out in the past about China. China has 68% of the world's solar water heaters on its rooftops using cheap technology. China at the same time, though, the world's number 1 or number 2 climate criminal, if we want to put it that way, depending on which measures we use. Where do you think the leadership is going to come from? We've got China being a big climate polluter, and we've also got the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement.
Well, Catherine, I think we need to remember two things. I think it's helpful perhaps to take a step back first and remember we don't use coal and oil and gas to annoy the world. We don't do it because it generates carbon emissions and global greenhouse effect. We do it because it gives us energy, which is what has brought a lot of people out of poverty. Remember, China, mostly with coal, has lifted about 700 million people out of poverty, an astonishing achievement in just 30 years. So the reality is a lot of people want the same opportunities. It's not surprising that they don't just worry about global warming. If a big UN survey showed that they actually worried the least about global warming, what they worry about is the fact that their kids don't have good food, that they don't have an education, that they die from easily curable infectious diseases. So we need to remember there are many, many other things we also have to solve and spend money on. But that doesn't mean we can't focus on fixing global warming, but it means we need to focus on fixing it cheaply. Mr. Randers talks about it would be wonderful to get everyone to move off fossil fuels. Yes, but it's exactly not going to happen as long as green energy is more expensive than fossil fuels. And that's why we need to drive much more through innovation. If we can get green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch. We're not there yet. But that's what Bill Gates and many others, Obama as well, was focusing on the sidelines of Paris, dramatically ramping up investment in green R&D. If we can innovate the price of green energy down, we fix the problem. If we don't, we will never convince people to spend a huge amount of their money on solving global warming.
It is true that there are great costs attached to some of these changes that people might make. Jürgen Randers, if I can put that point to you, isn't perhaps part of the problem that We're talking about very long periods of time here. Scientists like yourself working on this for your entire career, perhaps, whereas politicians are only in office for perhaps 4, maybe 5 years. If we look at the presidential terms in countries like the United States or France, isn't it perhaps a paradox? It's almost impossible to get politicians to think long term, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But I think it's important to understand how small the additional bill is. You know, Mr. Lomborg is arguing that we should wait until renewable energy gets cheaper than fossils. I agree that at that time it will be simple to accelerate the introduction of wind and sun. But if we wait that long, the world will warm, too much before we get to the action. So the real challenge at this point in time is to try to convince the ordinary voter to pay the extra cost. And the extra cost is of the order of 1% of the income of people in the Western world. So if people were willing to increase taxes by 1% roughly, and that 1% was used to introduce the more expensive wind and sun, and we did this for the next 50 years, it would solve the problem. I was once the chair of the Royal Commission in my country of Norway that made a plan for what it would cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Norway sufficiently to keep below the 2 degrees centigrade goal. And the cost was actually 250 euros per Norwegian per year to solve the whole problem. The same calculation can be done for France, and the same bill is the same. That it will cost of the order of 300 euros per Frenchman per year to solve the problem. And I think French and the rest of the rich world ought to do this, even while renewable is more expensive than coal, oil, and gas.
Well, certainly, if we look at the amount of activism that surrounds this kind of day, the amount of people that are saying on social media today that they're concerned about Earth Overshoot Day, there does seem to be a disconnect, doesn't there? Mr. Lomborg, if I come back to you to answer to Mr. Randa's point that we just don't have time to wait, people perhaps being a little bit selfish, saying that they want renewables to be cheaper. We are here in France, in the world's 5th richest country. Perhaps we just need to put our money where our mouth is, in the world's wealthier nations.
Well, it's easy to say that people are just being too selfish, but I think then you're assuming that you can solve the world's problems by changing human nature, and I'll say good luck with that, but it's not going to work. The reality is that most people, as Ms. Randa say, indicate that they're willing to spend in the order of $200 or possibly euros to fix climate change. The problem is that most of the economic estimates, for instance, of the EU climate policy, show that that's probably more like 400, 500, 600 euros per citizen. But if you actually want to get to 80% reduction in 2050, the estimates show that we're more likely talking somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 euros per person per year. Mm-hmm. And the simple answer is no one is going to stand up for that. No president is going to be able to do that. And that's because there are other issues as well beside climate change. And that's why we're only going to fix climate change if we find a cheap way to do that. It doesn't sound good to say. We'd love to be able to have everyone outpour their altruism and just do it, but it's not going to happen. People say they're very altruistic, but in reality, they're not all that much. They're willing to spend a little bit. And so my argument, and the argument of my group, the Copenhagen Consensus, who actually worked with 27 of the world's top climate economists and 3 Nobel laureates to look at where can you do the most good, emphasized don't try to put in a lot of renewables right now. Focus on making them cheaper in the future, because what really matters is that we, over this century, end up cutting and stopping using fossil fuels, and that will only happen if green energy becomes cheap enough.
All right. Well, in any case, it does seem that all the science points in the direction of time running out, in any case, for finding some solutions. Thank you very much, both of our guests on the France 24 debate. Bjorn Lomborg, who we were just hearing from there, director of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre, and Professor Jørgen Randers joining us there from Norway. Thank you both so much for your time. And thank you very much for being with us for today's France 24 debate. Do stay tuned.